Hello, friends. Yet another poem and more analysis. I really hate doing these, and then somebody requested that I do another one for Walt Whitman. So I decided, actually, I don't totally hate doing them. Alright, so we are reading my favorite poem ever written. It's by Walt Whitman called Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. Now this poem was written in first published in 1850, I believe, 56. Interestingly enough, Darwin has published his seminal work, what is it called? Origin of Species, 2 years before this. And in doing a little research, I looked at if Whitman had any influences from Darwin. And in 1855, I didn't find any exact reference to Darwin. But Whitman claimed in his preface to Leaves of Grass that was published the year before that science and poetry should live together. That poetry is a celebration of the laws of science. So I bring this up because this poem predates the existentialist movement, but it also foresees where Darwin's ideas of evolution will end up in philosophy. So, with Darwin, you have an explanation for how species evolve, which, taken to its most extreme and its least poetic, you end up with the point of view that humans exist, I exist, this little hat, this little fake fire, all of us exist simply by chance. So the origin of life began with the Big Bang, and then through a series of random coincidences, different elements come together, life erupts out of these combinations of elements, and we evolve as a species, giant brains, that are our primary evolutionary adaptation for survival. And a byproduct of this evolution is that we make up poetic stories about gods and meaning in life. That just makes us feel better. In actuality, our existence is totally random, and we are just a bunch of collections of cells that bump around and agree not to hurt each other. We make laws, but there is no greater law, like universal law. There was no plan. There's no greater scheme that we're all attached to. So, Whitman foresees this existentialist idea, and he makes an argument against it in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. So like most of the Romantics, he believes that there is some sort of larger scheme that we're all a part of. So it's neat the way this poem was written in 1856. Oh, I forgot, I set up a cool little flex here with all this hand sanitizer that I managed to squirrel away. Okay, sorry. 1856. Okay, so, going along with this Darwin idea or not Darwin's idea, but the existentialist idea that we are simply random collections of cells that share a planet together. There's no, universal something that combines us all together. If you take that idea and then you apply it to this poem written by Walt Whitman in 1856, you inevitably ask the question, how much can I really understand what this person who lives in this part of the country, so the poem takes place in Brooklyn at the ferry stop when the ferries would go, before the Brooklyn Bridge was made, ferry boats would go from Manhattan and Brooklyn as people returned from Manhattan to Brooklyn. So Whitman sets the poem in Brooklyn, looking across the river, the East River at Manhattan. You can see New Jersey in the background, and since the sun sets in the west, the sun is setting behind Manhattan. So he's at this confluence, or this place that the Hudson River, the East River, I guess Long Island Sound, and the Atlantic Ocean all come together. And he sets it here at sunset. And the poem describes what he sees there. And it's based on this idea, how much can we really understand what this guy is saying in, so what is that, 164 years ago. It's a very different culture. You can't drive, obviously, to Brooklyn from Manhattan. You have to take the ferry. So he lives in a very different time, very different values, and that's what he centers his idea of the poem on. So we're going to cover part 1 today. He begins and says, "Flood tide below me, I see you face to face." 2 exclamation marks in that line. Okay, so he's excited. The flood tide, if you have been, if you have been around the rivers, the Hudson River or the East River, they move with the tides. They're close enough to the ocean that during high tide, the river rises, low tide, the river falls. So, Whitman looks below him as he's at this ferry terminal, looks below him and sees the flood tide and says, "Hey, flood tide, I see you face to face." And then he turns his gaze upward, and in line 2 says, "Clouds of the west, sun there, half an hour high, I see you face to face." I see you also face to face, I'm sorry. So he takes these 2 things, or these 2 elements of the natural world, the flood tide that's below him, and the clouds that are in the sky when the sun is half an hour high. It takes place at sunset. The poem was originally titled Sundown Poem. So it's taking place at sunset. And you have these clouds that are above, we can guess, are reflecting the sunshine. So he begins and says, "I see you both face to face." He personifies both the clouds and the flood tide. Almost so. He opens up with this idea that there is some sort of relationship or understanding between him and the tide and him and the clouds. He gives them faces or personifies them like they are interacting with him as much as he's interacting with them. You skip a line there, so he just sets that up and basically implies here that it is possible to have a relationship with the natural world. There's something out there. It's not just a whole bunch of cells or a bunch of elements gathered together. There's some sort of presence that these have, and he looks at them face to face. Then the next section of part 1, line 3, he looks at the people around him. "Crowds of men and women, attired in the usual costumes. How curious you are to me." Another exclamation mark. He loves exclamation marks. Very excited about this. So he looks at the people and he says that they are dressed in the usual costumes. Alright, so at this point he begins to extract himself from the moment in time, this ferry terminal in 1856 that he's or 55 whenever he's writing this, and says these people around him are dressed in costumes. Usual costumes, which is an interesting use of the word costume instead of clothes. So he calls their clothes costumes, and this is the way he extracts himself from that time, because basically the clothes that we wear every day are costumes. And this works really, really well for the poem, because you're going to find out in part 1 that he is addressing this poem to us in the future. So that's what I really like about the poem. It's addressed to the people of the future. So he says, people of the future, basically I realize if you were standing right here, you would be like, wow, these clothes are really funny. And they are costumes. He's also implying that there's something more to the existence of a human than just the clothes that they wear. And he says, "How curious you are to me." So he's saying, I'm thinking about all you human beings around me. Line 4, he goes on ferry boats, the hundreds and hundreds that cross, returning home, are more curious to me than you suppose. Alright, and this is where he reaches out from 1856 with this "you," points right at you and says, oh wait, sorry, that's not it. He's talking to the people around him and says, these hundreds that cross, they are more curious than perhaps the people suppose, or you who is reading this right now. But he says, human beings, I think about you human beings dressed up in your costumes quite a bit. And then in line 5, he points directly at us. "And you that shall cross from shore to shore years hence are more to me, and more in my meditations than you might suppose." Okay, so this is where he points out from 1856 to us in the present days. He uses specifically from shore to shore, hence. So in the future, I've thought about you people who are going to stand at this exact place that I'm standing, and thought about what you thought. So there's this implication that you're reading the poem, or he's talking to you at this place that he's standing, but he's talking to you in the future. So he sets up his introduction to, or his first part of crossing Brooklyn Ferry says, like, he sets the scene, basically implies that there's something out there in nature that you can look at face to face. And these things, the flood tide, the clouds, you're going to see that Whitman specifically brings up things that he believes are going to be around for generations and generations in the future. So we can still go to that same spot on the East River underneath the Brooklyn Bridge, and we can still see the flood tide during high tide, and we can still see the clouds at sunset. So he's going to talk about in the future, like, the feelings that these give us. How different were they for me in 1856 than they are for you in 2020, 164 years removed from here. So he said, you people who are standing here, I've thought about you quite a bit. And then for the rest of the poem, he's going to describe his conclusions about what he believes about us who are standing here in the future, or the people who stand there even 160 years from, 164 years or whatever it is from now. So in the year 2184, people will still be able to stand next to the East River and see the flood tide coming in and watch the sun clouds setting. How will those people feel looking at that same thing as Whitman looked at it? So we'll explore that for the rest of the poem. Alright, I'll see you next week with part 2.